Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Silicon Avatar, which is episode 4 of season 5 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek, one episode at a time. In this video I cover the 5th season episode, Silicon Avatar. So Silicon Avatar is the episode in which the Crystalline Entity attacks a colony that Riker and his away team are at. 2 people were killed, but the away team and the other colonists survive by hiding in caves. An expert, Dr. Marr, is then brought on to hunt down the Crystalline Entity. Marr's son was killed in the original attack on Omicron Theta by the Crystalline Entity, and she at first harbors hatred towards Data as she transferred some anger towards Lore to Data. However, she eventually learns to trust Data when she sees how invested he is in hunting down the Crystalline Entity, and she gets Data to impersonate her son because Data has the knowledge or some letters from her son because he was given these memories by Noonien Soon during his creation. However, Dr. Marr is determined to kill and destroy the Crystalline Entity, but Picard would rather communicate with it, which she is very much against. But eventually they do track down the Crystalline Entity and they start communicating with it, but then Dr. Marr purposely sends over vibes that she knows will hurt the Crystalline Entity until it is destroyed against Picard's orders, and they're unable to stop her before the Crystalline Entity is killed. She then goes to Data and sees Data as the last living entity that carries her son, and tells her son through Data that she did it for him. However, Data responds rather coldly that her son would not have agreed with what she did and would in fact be very sad right now. So, So I did see this shortly after it came out. I didn't see it as it aired. I believe, if I remember correctly, my sister recorded it on VHS, and I saw it sometime later. But it was around the time I was first getting into Star Trek, so I believe I did see this episode before I saw Data Lore. So when I saw Data Lore, I was like, hey, that's that Crystalline Entity thingy. And also I remember when my sister recorded it on VHS, she missed the teaser, as they say, the first scene that happens before the credits. So I remember for the longest time I had no idea who Carmen was because she only appeared in that one scene, although her death was at the start of the episode. So I did see her death, but I didn't know who the hell she was. I just saw her get killed. And so it wasn't until like a year after, when that episode finally hit syndication, finally hit reruns, that I finally got to saw that first scene. I'm like, oh, so that's who that person is. So I have a sort of strange sort of relationship with this episode. So another thing I would point out, now that I'm in season 5, I forgot to point this out before, but I think now would be a good time to point it out. The opening credits, the opening theme, or the intro, has where it says Star Trek The Next Generation. For season 5, they changed the font where they have like trails going by on the title. And I've watched several reviews where they stated that thought that looked stupid and thought that it looked really dated and ridiculous, and they don't know why they did it. Now, I do remember why they did it. In fact, I think if my memory could be wrong, because it was 30 plus years ago. But if I remember correctly, reading in the Star Trek magazines or TV Guide, which I used to get, TV Guide loved doing articles about Star Trek. They loved Star Trek. But anyway, I think I do recall reading there the reason why they did those trails in the font was to celebrate Star Trek's 25th anniversary. So this was the 91. I remember this, and through to 92 was the year that during Next Generation's 5th season, basically, was Star Trek's 25th anniversary, and I remember them making a big deal out of it. There was a lot of... Apparently, there was 2 video games called Star Trek 25th Anniversary, and but I remember there was, these collectible cards I bought once over the summer that were to celebrate Next Generation cards that were meant to celebrate Star Trek's 25th anniversary, and of course Star Trek 6, which I will cover shortly with my revisited, also came out this year to celebrate Star Trek's 25th anniversary. So I remember them making a big deal. And I think apparently the special font with the trails was just meant to celebrate that, which is why it was only during the 5th season. When season 6 came along, they got rid of it, and so that those trails only appear in the 5th season. Now it's possible maybe they heard the complaints about that font and so changed it back during the 5th season, but I think it was never meant to stay. It was just there to celebrate the 25th anniversary, but I'm not entirely sure about that, so don't quote me on that. But anyway, I also remember reading articles, and it might have been Entertainment Weekly. I used to actually read magazines and stuff in the early 90s, and it might have been TV Guide, might have been Entertainment Weekly, might have been one of these Star Trek magazines, but I think it was Entertainment Weekly, where they showed Data. They had an article about Data, and they showed him playing the guitar. The article covered each of the characters, but when they had a little section about Data, they showed him playing the acoustic guitar, and they were making a big deal out of it. Now, I don't know if I had seen this episode then. Maybe I didn't. Maybe it took me a while before I went back and watched it on VHS, because I remember being Data plays the guitar. And that was rather random, though, that he just played it in this one scene. And this is the only episode, if I do recall correctly, that he played a guitar. Usually he plays a violin or something else. And it just seemed weird. He was just playing a guitar before Dr. Marr walked in the room, and he was like, oh, yes, and put the guitar down. So it seemed kind of pointless, but I guess it goes to humanizing him. And it is I did think it was interesting and added a different flavor to Data, that he's not just an unfeeling robot. I do wonder, though, if he was inspired or influenced to play the acoustic guitar by that country lounge singer who came on board the southern lounge singer who came on board from the 20th century, who came on board the Enterprise and was unfrozen in the first season episode, The Neutral Zone. That's actually what I assumed when I first saw this episode, because I believe I had watched season 1 for the first time around the time I had seen this episode. But my memory could again be wrong, because it was so long ago. But anyway, so I watched a bunch of different reviews on this episode, as I always do, and there seemed to be all over the place. Some people thought this episode was okay, others thought it was amazing, and others thought that it was not good at all. Now, if you're familiar with my channel at all or seen me talk about this episode before, you'll know that I love this episode. I'm more in the camp of, I think it was amazing. In fact, I was watching that one review, and I will not name what channel it's from because I don't want to throw shade at anyone, especially since I love this channel. But But they were saying, because I don't agree with everything the channels I like watch, which is good because I still like them even when they say stuff I disagree with. But anyway, in this channel or this video, the review for this episode, pretty much everything they said about it I totally disagreed with and wanted to argue with. In fact, I do think I was like yelling at my computer screen in some cases. And one of the things that they said, well, they said several things I disagreed with. They thought that the opening scene with the Crystalline Entity attacking was pointless and there was no reason for it to be there. I could not disagree more. I think it adds so much flavor actually seeing them come under attack by the Crystalline Entity. I think it adds so much more. They said that they spent too much time on Carmen, which baffles the hell out of me because she's barely in the episode. She was only in that one opening scene and had one conversation with Riker. If anything, they didn't spend enough time on her. I don't know how anyone could think they spent too much time on her. And they thought that it made Riker later when he went to Picard and suggested that they should kill the Crystalline Entity, that it made him imply that he was just compromised because his girlfriend died. But no, that was never my impression. It was always very clear to me that that had nothing to do with why he was suggesting. It was more of a tactical reason. In fact, Picard brought this up. Is like, I think you're letting your personal feelings interfere with it. And Riker said, with all due respect, I'm not a raw cadet. And I think, like, that's true. Like, that's what it's implying. The show isn't implying he's compromised. The show is making it very clear with his line that we're supposed to take Riker at face value because he's absolutely correct. He isn't a raw cadet. Now, it's possible the death of that woman is influencing in some way, sure, because everyone's human, everyone is influenced by their experiences, but it makes it clear that his suggestion to kill the Crystalline Entity is a professional one based off of the objective facts in this particular case. And I think Picard even bought that. But so I disagree with him there. And okay, well, I've actually heard several people say that they thought Dr. Marr wasn't portrayed very well because at first she hated Data, then she loved Data. I actually bought the transition. The theme, what was consistent through this, it's not her changing her character back and forth, because what's consistent is that she is deeply affected and motivated by her son's death. And so at first that meant, oh, well, fuck Data because his brother is Lore and they're responsible for killing my son. But then when she's presented with more information and takes more information on board, in fact learns that Data actually has some of her son's memory and can be a sort of avatar, as this episode title suggests, for her to communicate with her dead son, then she totally changes. And I think that's completely and utterly consistent with her character and makes all the sense in the world. But that's just me. Now, also the big one, and this is what I heard from several people, is that they think Picard was wrong for trying to communicate with the Crystalline Entity, and Riker was totally right. Now, all the arguments made for this seem to be operating on a false premise, in my humble opinion, because they seem to be operating on the false premise that Picard would allow the Crystalline Entity to kill more people, or that by communicating with the Crystalline Entity, then it's a foregone conclusion that it will definitely kill more people because of that, or at least a very strong possibility. And I would disagree with both of those stances because I don't understand where that conclusion is coming from, because they're making it clear, Picard makes it clear that he's willing to use force. Like he even says, like he tells Worf to modify their torpedoes so they can have a weapon against it, but he's like, let's hope we don't have to use it. So it's a last resort, but it's a resort. I think it's very clear that Picard will not allow the Crystalline Entity to kill more people, and that Picard's going to at first try to communicate with it, but if that fails and it doesn't succeed, or they get in a situation where the Crystalline Entity is going to try to kill people, he will use force to stop it. So it seems to be a false premise that either you communicate it or you kill it, or either you communicate it and let it kill people, or you kill it and prevent it from killing people. That's a false dichotomy. That is not the situation here, and that's, maybe I'm misinterpreting these reviews wrong, to be fair, but that's the impression I get of the scenario that they're presenting, is in this either or scenario. In fact, that's why I disagree with Riker, because Riker's like, if we have the opportunity to kill it, we should do it, because we can't allow it to kill any more people, and he's being overly cautious, which I can see where he's coming from. And again, I don't think he's being like totally influenced by the fact this girl, and even to call her his girlfriend is a bit too much. It was just someone he was about to sleep with and didn't get the chance to do it, from my understanding. and I don't think that's what's influencing him, but I do think he's being overly cautious, and I think that's coming off of a good place. He wants to make sure that it doesn't kill any more people. But Picard is right. If they can use diplomacy, if they can use communications to stop it first, then they should at least try. And if that fails, then they're ready. They got those photon torpedoes. They are ready to try to stop it by force. But it shouldn't be their first option unless it needs to be. And so I don't see a scenario where Picard would let the Crystalline Entity kill any more people. Like, that is not an option. So I don't see why they shouldn't try to communicate first. So, for example, when they're listening to that other ship that is under attack from the Crystalline Entity, and they hear those people like screaming as they're dying, the Enterprise is nowhere near them, so they can't do anything to stop it. But if, hypothetically speaking, they were close enough to stop it, I do believe very strongly that Picard would fire on the Crystalline Entity in order to save those people's lives. That he would use force and violence if it meant protecting people's lives. But then, but they were in a situation where the Crystalline Entity was no direct threat to anyone, as Picard even pointed out. Their shields fully protect them, so they're not in any danger. There's no one else around who's in any danger, so they have the leisure to try to communicate with it. But if they were in a situation where anyone, even one person's life was in direct risk, then Picard would definitely use force, and I really believe that. And plus, he's not going to just let it leave and go off and kill more people. If they can't use communication to stop it, he's going to follow it and stop it from doing it that way. So, in those cases, I totally think Picard's right. But some people may think I'm giving him too much credit, and perhaps I am, but I really, from every way that Picard's been portrayed, that does seem very much to be the case. And to Riker's defense, once Picard made his orders clear, Riker went along with it because he's a good first officer, and he was also appalled by the fact that Dr. Marr was disobeying his orders in order to kill the Crystalline Entity when it wasn't totally necessary. So this episode was written by Jerry Taylor. The story idea came from one of the submissions. I keep forgetting what they're called, but they open them up for submissions for anyone to submit it. And apparently it was a decree from on high, from Rick Berman and the bigwigs, that they not do any sequels or any follow-ups in Season 5. That might be because they did a lot of sequels in Season 4, and maybe they were like, when Season 5 was starting, they was like, yeah, I think we did way too much of that. People who only watch one episode and don't watch them in order, or could be really confused by all this continuity, all these recurring characters we had in season 4. So let's chill, and let's not do any sequels. But this episode, of course, breaks that rule because it brings back the Crystalline Entity from season 1. But apparently when they got the script, Jerry Taylor loved the idea, loved the story idea, which was about a woman whose son was killed in the Omicron Theta attack and was kind of really affected and was going gung-ho to kill the Crystalline Entity against Picard's wishes. And so she was like, that's a great idea. And Michael Piller agreed that was a really good idea. And so they were able to break the rule in this particular case. And of course, season 5 brings back Spock and Sarek, but that's, something else entirely. So it is interesting. It's very interesting comparing this episode to Data Lore. And it really shows how much Next Generation has changed and progressed in those 5 years. Because in Data Lore, and I still maintain it's not a good episode. A lot of people seem to like it, but I don't. But it's very cartoonish, especially if you watch these 2 episodes back to back. You see that Data Lore comes off as very childish, cartoonish, silly, sitcom-ish, syndication, as particularly Crystalline Entity, that in that episode was just some monster that was coming by to kill anyone, and Lore was being like the biggest, goofiest, mustache twirly villain. It was like, can you imagine its gratitude when I give it the life of the ship? It's like really bad. And so I actually think it's really a huge accomplishment that they're able to take that goofy monster, 2-dimensional monster from season 1, and make a very complex, dramatic story based off of it with a lot of ins and outs. Now, season 5 in particular is something that I'll probably get more into as we go deeper into season 5, is the dramatic season. That it was obvious, even for me at the time when I was first watching it, because I was first getting into Star Trek as season 5 was airing, so I was watching all the other episodes in syndication at the same time I was watching the new episodes of season 5, and it was obvious to me even then that season 5, I was more of seeing the difference directly because I was watching all the seasons side by side. And it was obvious to me that season 5 was very different in tone. It was much more dramatic and sort of slow-paced, drama-based. And I always accredit that to Jerry Taylor for having that tone. But I don't know if that's exactly true, because Jerry Taylor wasn't the showrunner in season 5, but she was for most of season 6 and for season 7. But season 6 and 7 have more of a dark, like, sort of suspense tone, which I always attributed more towards, like, Ronald D. Moore and Brennan Braga and Renee Echevarria, who were, like, the main writers, and, who was the other? Oh, Noreen Shankar. I think the 4 of them helped create the tone of season 6 and 7, even though Jerry Taylor was technically the showrunner. But then again, that's just a wild guess. Like, I don't know that for certain. Michael Piller could have had a lot to do with the dramatic tone. Maybe that was a decision that Michael Piller and Jerry Taylor made together, that they decided to take the Next Gen in a more dramatic way in season 5. And to be fair, there are some action-packed or intrigue episodes or suspenseful episodes in season 5, such as Unification, Ensign Row we just had, which was a political intrigue, and later there's Power Play, which is one of the most action-packed phaser fight episodes that Next Gen had done up to this point, and then Conundrum, which was another suspense intrigue episode, and then the Next Phase, which is kind of like a suspense action-y sciencey episode, and you got sciencey episodes like Cause and Effect as well. But I still feel like even through those episodes and even through those different genres, I think the drama or slow-paced dramatic tone prevails more than it would in earlier seasons. In earlier seasons, it wouldn't, even those action-type episodes would not come off as sort of drama and character-based. And I'll get into this more when I get into the middle of the season, because that's when I think that tone fails because it becomes far too boring. But for these first batch of episodes, it actually really works, particularly looking at Darmok in this episode. Those two episodes in particular, I think, have that strong, really adult, really complex, and really done well, dramatic, slow-paced drama feel to it that Star Trek definitely never had, or Next Gen definitely didn't have in its first 4 seasons. And as I said, sometimes it works for season 5, sometimes it doesn't work. But in these cases is when it definitely really does work. So it's not only is like the Crystalline Entity, like the difference between this episode and Data Lore is that Data Lore is in season 1 when the show sucked, and this is in past season 3 when the show was good. It's more than that. It's the fact that season 5 was so like slow-paced, drama-based compared to the cartoonish style of season 1, and it's just a vast difference. And I just think it's really impressive that they managed to portray the Crystalline Entity in this way. Now, I had said I revisited for Darmok that I came to the conclusion that I didn't really care for Joe Manowski's writing. That's not to say I never like his writing, because he did help contribute to some of my favorite episodes, and I thought Darmok was, even though I don't like it as much as everyone else, I still thought that was a really good episode. But I think overall I'm just not that big of a fan of his writing, and I think I came to the conclusion after watching this episode that the opposite is true of Jerry Taylor, that I am a fan of her writings. But again, not every one of her episodes is amazing. There's a lot of examples of episodes she did that I don't think were that so good. She wrote Sub Rosa. Well, actually, I think Brenna Braga had the writing credit for Sub Rosa, but she had the story by credit for Sub Rosa. And she kind of pushed this on Brendan Braga. In fact, I've heard someone reviewing Sub Rosa, and they were talking about blaming it on Brendan Braga. Oh, he wrote the episode. But I think that's not where the blame lies. I think the blame lies with Jerry Taylor, because she pushed that episode on him, assigned that episode to him. It was her idea, or at least it was someone else who submitted it, but she fully backed it. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about Sub Rosa. And she wrote Coda and Voyager, and you know how much I hate that episode. I think that episode's terrible. So she's not perfect, but I think overall, like, looking back at what she wrote about how she wrote The Drumhead, and then she wrote this episode, and I just think it shows like her dramatic chops are just like really, really good. And so, even though she's fumbled here and there, what writer hasn't? I think even Ronald D. Moore has turned out some stinkers. But I think overall, I do really like her as a writer. I think she contributed a lot. Just like I like Michael Piller as a writer, and I think they're both really great. But Michael Piller wasn't very happy with the results of this episode. He thought they didn't do as much as they could have. But the director, Cliff Boyle, whatever his name is, he really liked this episode. He thought it turned out very good. And as I said, the reviews that I've seen on this episode have been very mixed, and I always saw this as a very underrated episode, because I think it's very complex in a very subtle ways. It's very subtle in its approach, and I think that it's nuanced. And I think it actually really works a lot. As I said, I like the fact that it starts out with seeing the away team being attacked by the Crystalline Entity, because that contextualizes the threat. It makes it more than just theoretical. We see this, sexy woman that Riker's flirting with die right in front of our eyes, and we see the away team like close to death and having to hide in caves where they're losing air. And so that is a great way, in my opinion, to start off the episode. And then we introduce Marr, and they introduce her as antagonistic towards Data, so this kind of set the stage that she's unreasonable, and that she's a bit too affected by her son's death, even though she is an expert in the Crystalline Entity. And here's a side note I just wanted to point out before I forget, is that I just thought this was really interesting. I never noticed this little tiny detail. And this probably has to do with the fact that she's a civilian. At least I believe she's a civilian, because she's not wearing a Starfleet uniform, and they never say she's in Starfleet. But whenever Picard gives her an order or asks her to do something, he always says, please. Yeah, you might think that's a small detail, but when he's giving an order to one of his subordinates, someone on the Enterprise, someone who works in Starfleet, he doesn't say please. He says, Mr. Data, go analyze this. Geordi, go and fix the thing. Ensign, go take the con. He never says please, but whenever he says, ask Dr. Marr to work on communicating with the Crystalline Entity, he says, please. It's like, would you please work with Mr. Data to do this? Would you please do this? Now, I don't know if that was just because she's a civilian, but also maybe because she's being a bit hostile. And so he wants to sort of walk on eggshells around her and not just be brisk and say, do this, God damn it. He wants to be like, could you please do that? This is a really subtle touch. I didn't actually notice that before. I think that was actually really good. And I think it definitely needs to be noted. Oh, another person who didn't like this episode, Brent Spiner, which I don't know. Sometimes I really disagree with him because I think he does a really good job in this episode. But moreover, the actress who played Dr. Marr is amazing in this role. She does a really good job. I think that's helped by Jerry Taylor's writing. Jerry Taylor talked about how she was really invested in the script because she could relate, as a mother, she could relate to a mother who is so affected by her son's death that it makes her go off on this vengeance quest. And I think she did a freaking amazing job writing for this character, and they cast an actor who could take that good writing and really hammer it home. Because I think her antagonistic scenes with Data really work, and as I said, I buy her transition, which was actually, it wasn't sudden. It was like she realized that she was after a while where she saw Data was going out of his way to provide her valuable information to help them track down the Crystalline Entity, she realized that she had judged him wrong. But the more she learned about the fact that he had her son's memories and journal entries, the more she became sort of attached to Data. And she did kind of lose it a bit, especially towards the end, which I think also thought really was written very well, and I totally bought. And as I said, I think it had a lot of nuance. Now, I got to talk about the scene where she asked, because this is one of my favorite scenes. I think it brought a tear to my eye just watching this scene. When she asked Data to speak in Remy's, which is her son, speak in her son's voice. And Data was just like, well, what would you have me say? And she's like, oh, well, maybe you could read one of his journal entries. And Data was like, well, he didn't really have any journal entries, but he wrote a lot of letters to friends and family. Can I just read one of those? And Also, before that, she was talking about how he had a girlfriend, which she had no idea about, and she's like, "Well, I guess the last person he would tell would be his mother." And the other interesting thing to note is that this was the Omicron Theta incident was 26 years ago, so that means her son has been dead for 26 years. So this is you might think she would have gotten over, but it seems like she had been consumed by the need for revenge. And actually, obvious, and another thing, why this is so well written, so much good writing, is because it also, in her dialogue, portrays the fact that she felt a bit guilty over his death. Like when she was asking Data, can you tell me if he felt guilty? And she also talked about how she often wondered if he cried for his mother right before he died. And God, it's just so emotional, heavy stuff. But yeah, so then she asks him to read the letter, and he reads her like a letter towards her in her son's voice, where he's telling her how much he loves her and misses her. Now, this almost brought a tear to my eye, and I actually think this is brilliant writing, because Data, and I am a big defender of Data being more human than he lets on. And I still stand by that, and I think that's when he's written very well. But I think he's written very well here as well. Because even though Data does understand a lot of the human nuance, there's still a lot that escapes him. And I think it actually makes a ton of sense, and it's actually really good writing, that Data doesn't realize what he's doing here. That this is actually a huge fucking mistake, and that he shouldn't be doing this. He shouldn't be reading her son's letter where her son's saying "I love you, Mom" in her son's voice, when she's obviously very so affected by her son's death. And to see her reaction and her going to tears by this, like, as I said, this scene brings me into tears. But more than that, I think it's because you imagine, like, the situation if you have a loved one who passed away, and if you find, like, an android who has that loved one's memories and is able to imitate their voice and read letters you never got. Like, just imagine how fucking emotional that would be. And I think Data, I do buy that he's naive in human emotions, that he doesn't realize how affecting that will be towards her. Now, if I had one flaw in this episode, and it's a very minor one, and it's more of Monday morning quarterbacking, really, is that he should have consulted Troy, or Troy, if her powers were working, which I know they don't always do, Troy should have sensed from Dr. Marr, when she was with Data, that something was really wrong, that she was getting very emotional when she was around Data, and so Troy should have sensed something was going on, so she should have went to Data and asked him about it, and he would just very casually, "Oh yes, she asked me to read her son's letter in her son's voice," and Troy should have been like, "No, you shouldn't have done that. Don't do that," and sort of explain the situation to Data. It's like, she's very volatile and her emotions are volatile, and you're exasperating the situation and making her trauma worse by doing that. I think that would have been a really nice scene. But even Jerry Taylor underutilizes Troy. Apparently nobody knows how to write for her correctly. But I think that would have added a lot. And then they could have kept the same ending too. They could have kept the same ending, but I think that it would have added flavor to the episode if they had a scene like that with Troy. But anyway, as I said, it's a very minor complaint. So then you get the moment where they're communicating with the Crystalline Entity. And I think the music in this episode is absolutely brilliant. I didn't look up who did it, but I'm pretty sure it's Jay Chataway. It sounds like a Jay Chataway score because it's not quite as good as Dennis McCarthy, and I know Ron Jones left the show at this point. And I don't think Jay Chataway is as good as Dennis McCarthy, but I still think he can do some really good music. And I think, yeah, it is Jay Chataway, just looked it up. But I think that particularly when they meet the Crystalline Entity, the music does a really good job of hitting home the awe of the moment, and affecting just how magnificent and how spectacular it is. And I think the actors add a lot to that. It's all really well done, and I think that's why Riker sort of changed his mind a little bit and was more willing to let Picard communicate with it, because they actually started communicating with it, and it was they were like, oh, it's spectacular, oh, we're actually communicating it. And he was like, Picard was just so wonderful, it's like we can actually make some progress. But then Dr. Marr starts, let's try a continuous beam. And Troy is like, maybe it doesn't like what we're doing, and it's obvious it's reacting poorly. And here's another tiny little nitpick I have with the episode. It did seem to take Picard far too long to tell Data and Geordi to stop her, to cut it off, because he kept trying to talk to her, saying Dr. Marr, and she was just ignoring him. So it should have became, especially because he was already aware how much she wanted to kill it, she should have caught on immediately that Data, Geordi, shut this down. Now here's another thing. I think it might have been mentioned in my Patreon comments, so I might address it. I just want to bring it up now though. Is that I heard some people complain that it wouldn't have taken Data and Geordi that long, that they would have been able to stop Dr. Marr. She wouldn't have been able to lock out Data. But I actually disagree. I think that because they don't need to lock them out permanently. She just needs to lock them out for 30 seconds or 60 seconds or however long it was, just to give her enough time to kill it. And so I do buy that she would be able to do that, which is what she did. So that makes sense to me. So she kills it, and she seems completely in her own la la land world. She's completely oblivious to the fact that everyone is pissed and everyone's horrified. I think it was a particularly horrifying moment, even though, and this is another thing, a lot of reviewers seem to be, oh, I don't care that it died. It doesn't make any difference. Oh, it doesn't affect me. Who cares? Which I am surprised by that reaction. Ever since I first saw this, that scene where, the communicating and the music portrays, oh, how wonderful this is. And, oh, isn't it spectacular? And it's beautiful. And then, boom, it's dead. It's very jarring. It's very effective, even though that it's like a monster. It's like a killing machine that goes around killing thousands of people. It's still awful that it died in that way. That it seemed, and this could be wrong, but it seemed at least that it was communicating with them and making connection with them, and there's a way that they could convince it not to kill any more humans, or at the very least it was showing trusting the ship and reaching out to it, and then for the Enterprise to respond by giving it some shit that's gonna kill it and make it explode is very, I'm trying to find the right word. It's very disgusting. It's very nasty. It's very deceitful. And it's just horrifying that they would do that. I mean, it doesn't matter that this is a killing machine. It's still horrifying that they would kill it in that way. As I said, if they were in a situation where it's about to kill some people, and they go by and fire some photon torpedoes at it and destroy it, that wouldn't be horrifying at all. That would be self-defense. That would be totally marking. And And I don't think, like, some people could compare it to, like, a serial killer, but I don't think that would be an apt analogy. I think the analogy that Picard gave earlier in this episode about a whale just eating cuttlefish, it's not evil, it's just feeding. I think that's more appropriate. It just so happens that in this situation, the humans are the cuttlefish, and so they look at it a bit differently. But I think in practice, that analogy holds a lot more. So if they're able to communicate with it and say, hey, you know, we're actually sentient, so maybe not kill us. And they were close to doing that, perhaps. We don't know, but we never will know because she didn't even try it. She just killed it right away. And so that's just disgusting that she would do it. So I was actually really affected by its death. But anyway, she's often just smiling and says, and she's like patting Data's hand. I love how, Picard orders Worf to escort her to her quarters, but Data's like, oh, allow me, sir. And I love Picard's response. He's like, fine. He's just really not happy. And so then Data takes her to the quarters, and she starts talking to Data as if he was her son, saying, I did it for you, Remy. And she asked Data to, like, speak to her again in his voice and tell her that he understood and he did the right thing, or she did the right thing. And I love Data's response. Again, this is like very good use of Data's sort of straightforward, non-feeling manner, where he just matter-of-factly tells her, is like, no. Like, that, from everything I know about his, personality and his memories and his journal entries and his letters, is that he actually wouldn't like this. He wouldn't have approved. He liked your career as a scientist. He was proud of it, and you've thrown that away. So yeah, he would be very sad right now. And then he says, I'm sorry, Dr. Marr, I cannot help you, and leaves. Now, some people describe that as being cold as ice, but I describe it more of Data being really matter-of-fact. And that's totally... And in fact, I think this was slightly a human side of Data to have that response, because he wasn't being just a straight-up unemotional robot. He was actually using his knowledge of what he understands of human emotions and interpreting these memories that were implanted to him of her son to deduce that what emotion he would be feeling right now. So it was actually kind of a human response from Data, and in fact, he's kind of portraying his disappointment in her. Data's disappointment, not just Remy's disappointment, but Data's disappointment in her for killing the Crystalline Entity. And that's why he's kind of cold and is like, I'm sorry, I cannot help you, and walks out of the room. Now, this is also, again, there's a lot of implications here, a lot of commentary towards people who are who constantly, could be commentary on the death penalty, for example, because a lot of people who are pro to death penalty is like, well, if your son or your daughter was killed, you would want them killed too. But that's just seeking revenge. You definitely want them arrested. You want them off the streets. You want them, want other people to be safe from them so that they don't kill anyone else. But by employing the death penalty, that's just revenge. They killed my son, so I want them to be killed as well. And the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of people, some people who are actually in that situation, not just hypothetical, but some people who are in that situation who would say, no, I don't want them killed, even though they killed my son, even though they killed my daughter. The death penalty is still wrong. It's not up to the state to execute, to murder people. And if they're religious, they think that they'll justify this by saying that God will punish them. But either way, there are some people who don't feel that need for revenge. And I think this episode does a really amazing job of analyzing how the futility and the need for revenge. And how she thought that killing this monster would give her peace and would give her son, like, oh, I put my son's memory at rest, you can finally rest in peace. And Data dishes out the cold hard fact that actually no, he would not approve of what you just fucking did. I think that's powerful. I think that is really powerful. So yeah, overall, I just think this episode it's a triumph, is what I would call it. So anyway, I would like to thank all those who support me on Patreon. I want to give some very special thanks to Brandon Neal Howells. Thank you so much for all your support. It means a lot. But would also like to give a shout out to Antarius, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Valls, Alessandro Michelosio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Britton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So we do have a few Patreon comments for this episode. First comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, Jerry Taylor wrote the teleplay and Lawrence V. Clooney, I believe, Conley, something like that. He did the story and was his only ever written credit. Star Trek has a lot of one-hit wonders. Now, I want to pause here to answer that because they had the open submissions policy. That's why they have a lot of one-hit wonders. Because whenever you see the story by credit, that's someone who's... and they have no other writing credits in Hollywood, it's because they did it through this open submission policy. But anyway... I can understand Dr. Kyla Marr's reasoning for not trusting Data. Damn you, Lore. She soon finds out that Data is nothing like his brother. I know I make fun of Riker a lot for being a womanizer, but wow. I'm not sure who was worse here, Riker or Carmen, or was it a tie? Suzal Doyle, who played Al Kalaviki's wife in Quantum Leap, actually reprised her role in the new Quantum Leap. Like the original, it was canceled. So I guess she played Carmen. I agree with Dr. Kyla Marr and Riker that the Crystalline Entity should be destroyed. However, what she did on the bridge was overkill, as they found a way to communicate with the Crystalline Entity. Deanna must have been recharging her superpower, and Picard took 4 years to give the order for her to stop. Worf was out of character in this episode. He didn't even object when they decided to communicate with the Crystalline Entity. Maybe he was tired of getting rejected all the time and kept his mouth shut this time. My rating is 7 days before the Crystalline Entity attacks France. Would you think differently, Picard, or are you letting your feelings get in the way out of 10? Actually, I don't think he would have acted differently. I think Picard would have acted exactly the same. I think he would have done anything he could to prevent the Crystalline Entity from attacking France, but he would have tried communicating with it first. Just my humble. So next comment is from Antarius, who says, the first act is really strong, but after that, the rest of the episode is boring and irritating. Dr. Marr's attitude towards Data and her accusations were very annoying. Her character and the story about her son really got on my nerves. Why doesn't Data or Riker immediately use the tricorder instead of relying on Data's hearing when the strange noise appears? Concerning the theme of revenge, the Doomsday Machine is clearly a superior episode. My rating is 4 out of 10. Without the first act, it would be a 3. Wow. So, Antarius, we are going to have to agree to disagree on this one, as I actually think this is far superior to Doomsday Machine, but that is just my humble opinion. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, in my humble opinion, this is an incredibly underrated episode, and I dare say one of the best of the show. This is exactly what Star Trek is This is exactly what Star Trek is at breaking conventions. Most sci-fi shows or stories will be a big, unstoppable alien or monster that is destroying everything because it is evil. But instead, it makes it so dynamic and interesting. The creature is indeed intelligent and wasn't aware of the harm that it was causing. And I love that Captain Picard and Data were quick to conclude that it was They were quick to conclude that it wasn't evil and that it should be taken down, typically good guy versus bad guy. Yes, Riker wanted to kill it, but it was a bit understandable considering that his one-off was killed. But unlike most people, I love the scenes between Data and Dr. Marr, especially when they discuss her son, and that Data was able to decipher her son's message with his voice. It was quite touching, and I really brought this character and found her story of losing her son very tragic. And the final scene where she manages to kill the crystal alien and was happy that it was gone. I loved the final scene where Data tells the Doctor that he believes her son wouldn't have wanted her to kill the alien and that if he was alive he would have not been happy. And it leaves a sense of darkness in the episode that was so powerful. I know this makes me weird, but I love this episode, so my rating is a 10 out of 10. Doesn't make you weird, Ricky. It makes you in complete agreement with me. Could not agree more that I love the scenes with Data and Dr. Marr. I thought they were absolutely amazingly well done. I think the dramatic tension at the end, and I love the ending where it left that eerie feeling. It was just one of the most powerful endings the show ever did. So, we have another comment from Norman Buchwald who says, okay, I can see some calling the latter part of the episode boring, when in fact I do find it compelling. Dr. Marr is one of the main one-time compelling and clearly imperfect characters coming on board the ship, who chooses not to engage with Starfleet optimism due to her prolonged grief, and does finally do what she was sort of compelled to do, which is to kill the Crystalline Entity, which at the time in the Trek universe was the only one we knew, and thus was assumed to be the same one that killed her son. And Data is it is a Data episode who has the challenge to be on target as Blame, and later the representative of the Sun as he stands for the Silicon Avatar to both what killed her son, thus distrust as he is also Lore, and later as literally her son. This is actually good, compelling stuff and storytelling with an ending I suspect most of us knew what was going to happen, but still compelled to see it through. Regardless, there are two main criticisms of this episode. One, the obvious retcon in bringing into the question why at least earlier on Starfleet did not explore what happened on this colony, including who was on it, a family member like Dr. Marr worried about her son, etc. Now, not only do we know who was on it, as we always knew, but Data has not only logs, but easily provide them in the voice of actual persons, and they didn't get crucial information when they found Data sometime after a colony that mysteriously no longer has anyone. The second is Riker. You know, in an episode later this season, Riker thinks he finally found his true love and the romance of the week and makes a whole point to tell Troy all about it. And yet he seems to have feelings almost every week. And while he feels strongly enough about his fling to feel like Dr. Marr that the entity should be punished, a booty call and one's flesh and blood son, well, hardly seems comparable. We hardly saw Riker and her except to joke about dessert and saw her do a virtuous act that led to her death by protecting an old man. To see Riker be turned by emotions like this is a bit hard to buy, and makes it sound like someone in the writer's room argued, well, someone on the bridge needs to share with Dr. Marr, and here's a scenario for it. I don't know. I guess it is true, Riker's character. I mean, the game, he is going to be eager to have the Katarian woman who left that brainwashing of consuming cones to him not spend any time in jail and to be forgiven for it in or is it stunned to disintegration like Utah? When I hear people complain about how Janeway is treated by the writers, maybe we also need to examine Riker, including Picard Season 3. Maybe when out of nowhere he throws Picard off the bridge. Anyway, back to the story. It's the final tragedy of the situation, and Dr. Marr, which Data honestly tells her she cannot be forgiven for her vengeance, that makes the story truly powerful. So I have to give this 8 crystalline entities that lower decks crews were willing to have that evaluator endure out of 10. So, first of all, I disagree with your assessment of Riker. I don't think the writers were saying that he was so affected by a booty call that he was willing to go out of his way to kill the crystalline entity, and I don't think they were making a comparison to Dr. Marr's grief and Riker's grief. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I really think that they were saying that Riker is actually giving a pretty solid argument. In fact, there's a lot of viewers out there who agree with Riker. That is actually the more prudent or the safer thing to do is to kill it. So he's not. And I think, again, like I said earlier, when he says, I'm not a raw cadet, I don't let these emotions interfere with my better judgment, I think the writers are telling us that is true. I think we're meant to take Riker at his word. So I think they're just presenting the other side, which is also valid, even though I do agree with Picard over Riker. I think his perception or his caution of wanting to safeguard lives is actually valid. So I don't think personally that they're trying to imply that Riker is so affected by this fling that he's willing to throw all logic out the window. Now, you do make a good point about lower decks. This is something I forgot to mention, is that we do see a crystalline entity, and it's also a good point that maybe this isn't even the same crystalline entity that destroyed Omicron Theta. This could be a different one because there's more than one. I always wanted to write a fan fiction when I was a teenager of having multiple crystalline entities, but Lower Decks shows this to be true because they flew the ship into a whole family of crystalline entities in order to scare that evaluator. And then, of course, Lower Decks also features the crystalline entity in its opening credits. But Lower Decks is canon. We can take that as the word that there's more crystalline entities. Anyway, Norman Buckwald has a few more comments. Oh, one other thing which I realize here is yet another example where Troy's abilities are just not happening for whatever reason. I'll especially get into that when I comment on A Matter of Time. I know often the writers try to do something that say that the alien presence can not outstrengthen Worf but elude Troy, but they do that way too often. It gets comical, and in the case of Troy, it gets worse when she can't even read humans, which of course she's half human herself. Rasmussen gets on my nerves the most on her failure, but Tashi Yar's sister, Dr. Marr, maybe even Admiral Satie, I would expect Troy to have much fever, has her running on up to the bridge and Samaritan Snare when they do remember she has empathic abilities. I know another reviewer said the dilemma is Troy can be the plot buster because her abilities, and thus the writers either throw in a lame reason to choose to ignore it. Anyway, sigh. Here's that example yet again. Troy should have known Dr. Marr's intentions when she first got on the ship through empathy, just the fever. And maybe with better writing, there could have been a scene at least with her and Riker discussing this, and her calling him on this if Riker is still to be vengeful as well. In other words, it's too bad in Trek we couldn't have had the Troy stare, at least that O'Brien got in The Wounded. It was needed much more often and would have done wonders for her character. I kind of said something similar earlier. Like, I don't know if Troy should have been, like, you said that she should have known Dr. Marr's intentions from the start, but she kind of did, and Picard and Dr. Marr actually didn't hide those intentions, so Picard didn't need Troy to tell him that because Dr. Marr told him that herself. But I didn't mention earlier that Troy's powers should have came into effect with her interactions with Data. She should have sensed that something was wrong with her in her interactions with Data. And as for like when Marr went to kill the entity, yeah, I mean, maybe you're right. Maybe Troy should have sensed that a bit earlier. I know Troy did say after Marr started the beam, Troy said something's wrong, but I think she was more referring to the crystalline entity being hurt so she was sensing the crystalline entity's pain rather than the murderous intentions from Dr. Marr, which she should have sensed earlier. So I actually agree with you there. Anyway, Norm Buckwald has another comment. Given that this was the episode where Troy at least said to Picard about Dr. Marr's prejudice toward Data, I don't think you need an empath for me to tell you. It didn't mean for the rest of the episode. Troy should have deliberately turned her empathic powers almost 100% off. Troy should deliberately turn him. Anyway, yeah. So, let's see. I believe we have one more comment. This one from Brandon Neil Howells, who says, this is a better episode than I remember. The silicon avatar of the title is Data, I think. It is just as well that someone carved those stairs leading into the cave where the people trying to escape the entity might have broken a limb, huh? Kyla Marr seems overly enthusiastic to interview the survivors, points to the actress for her portrayal. She even looks like her dad. Her father was Will Geer, who played the grandfather in The Waltons. And so very driven. I'm getting Pulaski vibes off her. Who thought it was a good idea to program Data with the memories of the voices of the colonists, and why? Because I am sure hearing her dead son's voice is what pushed Kyla Marr over the edge. Sorry, but I just don't buy that Kyla Marr is able to prevent the Enterprise crew, including Data, from enacting the destruction of the giant snowflake. I'm laughing because of what snowflake means in today's slang. 7 memorable desserts out of 10. It's Riker's favorite part of dinner. Anyway, I never saw The Waltons, so I don't even know who that is. I'm not sure if I would say Pulaski vibes off of Kyla Marr. I think she's a bit worse than Pulaski. I think that's actually a bit of an insult to Pulaski to say that. And I already addressed the fact that I actually do buy that Data and Geordi wouldn't be able to stop her in time because it only took like 30-60 seconds. But I agree with people said earlier that Picard shouldn't have waited so long to give the fucking order. But anyway, thank you, patrons, so very much for your comments. So my rating for Silicon Avatar out of 10 is a 10, the best. Yeah, I'm a bit overzealous. Even the people who liked this episode gave it a 7 or an 8, except for Ricky, of course, who gave it a 10, and I'm on board with him. I agree with him on this episode entirely. That, I was thinking of giving this episode a 9 at first. But the more I thought about it, and especially after recording my review for it, it made me realize just how complex and how dynamic and how special this episode is. And so I might call it a weak 10, but I definitely think it deserves a 10 out of 10. I think this is, like Ricky said, one of the most underrated episodes of Star Trek. In fact, I went back and watched my top 10 underrated episodes video I did to see if I included this episode, but I didn't. I think that I should have. I think this was an extremely well written, extremely well acted episode that explores, a lot of nuance and it's really in really subtle ways, really affecting ways. Like, they had really powerful scenes, such as Data speaking to her in her son's voice. And that has so much nuance to it because it portrays just how naive Data is to human emotions, because not realizing how it's going to push her over the top, and having the portrayal of Dr. Marr being like, and I don't think she went completely mad, by the way. I don't think she went completely crazy towards the end. I think she was just really sort of seeing Data as an avatar, as a surrogate for her dead son. But then Data, like, splashing her with the cold water is like one of the worst things he could have possibly done to her in that moment. In fact, I've heard others speculate that she killed herself, that could have easily happened, and I can buy it. So yeah, it has a really powerful message on the futility of revenge, like subtle but powerful, and it's just, the great interactions with Picard trying to communicate with the entity, like the way the episode's presented with the music that presents the awe and just the acting all around. Like, I think this is one of the top tier episodes, and I don't know why so many people don't like it as much. I don't know. Always be a puzzle for me. Anyway, that is it for my review of Silicon Avatar. So, to see what's coming up next on my channel, if I can find it. So, Wednesday will be my review for Disaster. Thursday, I'll do my season-long review for Season 5 of Star Trek Discovery. And then Saturday, I'll be over on Patreon for revisiting my review for The Game. And then Monday, back on my main channel, this time actually covering The Expanse Dragon's Tooth, which is a series of comic books. So not much new to cover with The Expanse, but I thought I'd review the comic books that came out recently for The Expanse. So that is coming up on my channel, so be sure to check it out and keep up with many more reviews on Star Trek Next Generation and many other Star Trek videos, as well as covering Discovery and many other shows. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.